Imagine a world where the mafia's power runs so deep that it doesn't just control the streets, but influences politics, the economy, and even international business deals. A world where a single man's name could inspire fear in rival gangs, respect in politicians, and silence in the media. That world existed in Russia, and the man at the center of it all was Sergei Mikhailov, better known by his underworld name, Mikhas. Mikhailov's story is not just about crime. It's the tale of how one man transformed from an ordinary citizen into one of the most feared mafia bosses of the modern era. It's a journey from the quiet corners of Moscow's suburbs to the very top of the criminal underworld, where billions of dollars, corruption, and global influence became his reality. Born in 1958 in Moscow, Sergei Mikhailov came from a humble, working-class family. His childhood was far from glamorous. Like many Soviet citizens, his early years were defined by scarcity, economic struggle, and the constant pressure of living under a rigid communist system. Yet even as a young man, Mikhailov was ambitious. He knew the straight and narrow path. Working an ordinary job, following the rules, would never give him the wealth, status, or influence he craved. In the late 1970s, Sergei found work as a waiter in a local Moscow restaurant. On the surface, it seemed like an unremarkable job. But this restaurant was more than just a place to serve food. In the Soviet Union, restaurants, bars, and nightclubs were the meeting grounds for underground deals, black market trades, and mafia networking. Here, Sergei rubbed shoulders with Moscow's growing underworld figures. He learned how deals were made, how protection rackets were run, and most importantly, how money flowed through both legal and illegal channels. By the 1980s, as the Soviet Union's economy began to crumble, corruption and black market activity surged. Shortages in everyday goods created opportunities for anyone daring enough to operate outside the law. Mikhailov saw his chance. He started small, getting involved in extortion rackets and protection schemes. But unlike the average thug who relied solely on intimidation, Sergei took a smarter approach. He built relationships, gathered loyal men around him, and used strategy rather than just brute force. This ability to think like a businessman set him apart from countless other gangsters of his time. It was during this period that Sergei Mikhailov became connected to the most notorious criminal syndicate in Russian history, the Solntsevskaya Bratva, or Solntsevskaya Brotherhood. Rising from Moscow's Solntsevo district, this group quickly became the most powerful mafia organization in Russia. Mikhailov's intelligence, ambition, and organizational skills propelled him through the ranks. Before long, he wasn't just a member. He was on his way to becoming one of its key leaders. This was also when he adopted the nickname Mikhas. In the underworld, names carry power, and Mikhas soon became synonymous with fear and authority. He wasn't seen as just another gangster. He was a strategist, someone who understood that true power lay not only in violence, but also in connections. Mikhas forged ties with businessmen, politicians, and even members of law enforcement. In Moscow during the late 1980s and early 1990s, his influence was unmistakable. What makes his rise so fascinating is that it didn't happen through brute strength alone. Mikhas understood the value of legitimacy. While other gangsters were content with street-level operations, he was already envisioning a global empire, one that stretched from Moscow to Europe and even America. From waiter to mafia kingpin, Sergei Mikhailov's transformation was only the beginning. But how exactly did he seize control of the Solntsevskaya Bratva? How did he turn it into a billion-dollar empire with influence across continents? And how did he manage to outwit rivals, law enforcement, and even governments for decades? By the late 1980s, Russia was changing. The Soviet Union, once a rigid system of control, was crumbling. The streets of Moscow buzzed with uncertainty, opportunity, and chaos. And in this chaos, The Solntsevskaya Bratva rose like a shadow empire. Sergei Mikhailov, now known as Mikhas, was right at the heart of it. The Solntsevskaya group wasn't just another street gang. It was organized, disciplined, and hungry for power. Unlike smaller groups that fought for scraps, the Bratva thought like a corporation. They had leadership, ranks, financial planners, and even lawyers, and Mikhas was one of the architects who turned this gang into an empire. At first, the group controlled protection rackets in Moscow's Solntsevo district. They demanded payments from small businesses, nightclubs, and restaurants. But Mikhas had a bigger vision. He realized that with the Soviet Union collapsing, massive amounts of state-owned property and businesses were about to be privatized. Factories, real estate, oil companies, and banks were suddenly open for grabs, and whoever controlled them would control the new Russia. Mikhas used violence when necessary, but he relied even more on strategy. He partnered with corrupt officials, bribed politicians, and infiltrated business circles. With the collapse of communism, many state workers were unemployed, desperate, and willing to work for anyone who paid. Mikhas recruited them into his network. Ex-KGB agents, police officers, and soldiers soon became part of his empire, giving him not only muscle but also intelligence and protection. One of his most powerful moves was to expand internationally. While rivals focused on Moscow turf wars, Mikhas built networks abroad. He established contacts in Hungary, Austria, Israel, and even the United States. His men invested in hotels, casinos, and nightclubs, not just for profit, but also to launder dirty money. Billions of rubles made from extortion, smuggling, and arms trafficking flowed through these businesses and returned as clean wealth. By the early 1990s, Mikhas and the Solntsevskaya Bratva were no longer just a Russian gang. They were one of the largest mafia syndicates in the world. Their empire stretched across continents. They trafficked in drugs, weapons, and even human beings. They ran one of the most sophisticated money laundering systems ever seen, funneling billions through offshore accounts. And yet, Mikhas didn't flaunt his wealth in a reckless way. He lived in luxury but carefully. His palaces and foreign properties were hidden under layers of shell companies. He wore the mask of a businessman, clean suits, polite words, even charitable donations. This image gave him access to elite political circles in Russia and abroad. But power always attracts enemies. Rival gangs, police agencies, and even foreign governments began to take notice of Mikhas's activities. He wasn't just another criminal boss. He was becoming a geopolitical figure, a man who could shift economies and politics with the sheer weight of his underworld empire. The big question was, how long could he stay untouchable? When Sergei Mikhailov, better known as Mikhas, began building his empire, he understood one crucial truth. Violence alone could not sustain a criminal dynasty. To dominate Moscow's underworld and beyond, he needed a network, an empire that stretched across industries, borders, and governments, and that is exactly what he built. At the heart of Mikhas's operations was drug trafficking. During the EI's 1990s, Afghanistan's heroin became one of the world's deadliest commodities, and Russia was the perfect gateway into Europe. Using routes through Central Asia and the Caucasus, his men moved tons of heroin into Moscow, then funneled it through Eastern Europe, eventually flooding markets in Germany, Italy, and beyond. The profits were staggering, and unlike small street gangs, Mikhas operated like a corporation. He ensured supply chains were protected with bribes, violence, and partnerships with international cartels. For many, he was not just a gangster, he was a global distributor of addiction. But Mikhas didn't stop there. He also built an arms smuggling empire. The collapse of the Soviet Union left thousands of weapons depots unguarded, and corrupt military officials were willing to sell to anyone with cash. Kalashnikov rifles, explosives, even anti-aircraft systems were reported to have passed through Mikhas's networks. His reach connected warlords, militias, and terrorist groups across continents. To his associates, he was not just a mafia boss, he was a shadow arms dealer fueling global conflicts. Another dark chapter of his empire was human trafficking and prostitution rings. Across Russia and Eastern Europe, young women were promised jobs abroad, only to end up trapped in the sex trade. Hotels and nightclubs controlled by the Solntsevskaya Bratva served as both recruitment grounds and distribution points for these illegal operations. Mikhas turned human misery into another revenue stream, and his influence spread into cities like Tel Aviv, Budapest, and even New York. Yet, perhaps the most brilliant side of Mikhas was his mastery of money laundering. Unlike other gangsters, who flaunted wealth recklessly, Mikhas built a facade of legitimacy. He invested in luxury hotels, casinos, nightclubs, and even banks. His fingerprints could be found in businesses stretching from Moscow to Switzerland. Offshore shell companies and fake real estate transactions washed dirty money into clean investments. By the mid-1990s, Mikhas was no longer just a street boss. He was a criminal CEO, a man who blurred the line between mafia and multinational corporation. And while violence was always a weapon in his arsenal, Mikhas preferred corporate takeovers and privatization scams. As Russia sold off state assets after the Soviet collapse, Mikhas and his men muscled into industries, oil, metals, and construction through intimidation and bribery. Businesses unwilling to cooperate faced threats, bombings, or sudden disappearances. Those who agreed became partners in one of the most profitable and feared organizations in Russia's history. By the late 1990s, Sergei Mikhailov's Solntsevskaya Bratva was no longer just a gang from Moscow's Solntsevo district. It was a global criminal syndicate, with billions flowing through its accounts and influence that reached into parliaments, police departments, and corporate boardrooms. Mikhas had transformed himself from a street racketeer into the mastermind of an empire that thrived on drugs, guns, human lives, and corruption. He wasn't just running a mafia. He was running a parallel economy, one that thrived in the shadows of post-Soviet chaos. And the world would soon discover just how untouchable he had become. By the mid-1990s, Sergei Mikhailov was no longer just a criminal overlord. He was a man whose power rivaled that of politicians and businessmen in Russia. His wealth was immense, but his real genius was how he converted that money into influence. While many gangsters flaunted their riches, Mikhas used his to quietly build networks that stretched far beyond Moscow's dark alleys. He moved billions through Swiss banks, shell companies, and offshore accounts. His fingerprints were found in places as far as Liechtenstein, Cyprus, and Panama. Investigators believed that Mikhailov had control over hotels, casinos, oil companies, and even banks in Europe and the Middle East. These weren't just investments, they were tools. Every hotel room could be a meeting place, every casino a money laundering machine, every oil company a cover for smuggling operations. But what made him nearly untouchable was his relationship with the political elite. In post-Soviet Russia, corruption wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Mikhas understood that if you wanted to run an empire, you needed protection from above. So he poured money into bribing politicians, police chiefs, and even security service officers. There were whispers that some parliament members owed their seats to his financial backing. Businessmen who wanted government contracts often had to go through Mikhas first. This blending of mafia and politics gave rise to a terrifying phrase, the criminal state. For many Russians, it felt like the mafia wasn't operating in the shadows anymore. It was sitting in government offices, writing laws and controlling industries. Internationally, Mikhas's influence expanded too. He forged alliances with Italian mafia families, Colombian cartels, and Israeli crime bosses. In Switzerland, he was even accused of laundering money through respected financial institutions. The Russian mafia, once seen as thuggish street enforcers, had now entered the boardrooms of Europe, and at the center of it all was Sergei Mikhailov. By this point, law enforcement agencies worldwide were alarmed. Interpol, the FBI, and European police all had files on Mikhas. But every time investigators closed in, witnesses disappeared, cases collapsed, and evidence vanished. Mikhas wasn't just rich, he was insulated, protected by a web of lawyers, politicians, and corrupt officials. He wasn't a fugitive hiding in the shadows. He was dining in five-star restaurants, vacationing in the French Riviera, and walking into Moscow's elite nightclubs surrounded by bodyguards. For many, he was more than a gangster. He was a symbol of the new Russia, powerful, ruthless, and untouchable. But empires built on fear and corruption always attract attention, and Mikhas's came crashing into the spotlight in 1996 when Swiss authorities finally made their move. After years of investigation, Sergei Mikhailov was arrested in Geneva on charges of money laundering, extortion, and organized crime activity. The world media erupted. This was one of the most powerful mafia bosses in the world, finally behind bars. The trial that followed was unlike anything Switzerland had ever seen. Prosecutors accused him of funneling billions through Swiss banks, using luxury hotels as fronts and bribing officials at the highest levels. Witnesses came forward, some anonymously, claiming he controlled the Solntsevskaya Bratva, one of the largest mafia organizations in history. But then, the case began to crumble. Witnesses refused to testify. Evidence disappeared. Some accounts say jurors were intimidated, while others suggest Swiss authorities simply underestimated the reach of Mikhas's influence. After nearly 2 years in prison, Sergei Mikhailov walked free in 1998. The verdict shocked the world. Some celebrated it as a failure of Western justice. Others whispered it was proof that Mikhas's tentacles reached even into Europe's most secure institutions. He returned to Moscow, not as a disgraced criminal, but as a legend. To his supporters, he was untouchable. To his enemies, he was invincible. This wasn't the only brush with the law. Russian authorities repeatedly tried to bring charges against him, ranging from fraud to racketeering, but none stuck. Bribery, intimidation, or sheer lack of evidence always saved him at the last moment. In a country where the line between government and gangsters was blurred, Mikhas knew how to survive. But every trial, every arrest, and every news headline only strengthened his myth. The man they couldn't convict became larger than life, a symbol of how power and money could outmatch any legal system. After his release, Mikhas became more careful. He understood that too much attention could destroy even the strongest empire. So he stepped back from the spotlight, allowing others in the Solntsevskaya Bratva to handle daily operations. Yet, his name never disappeared. It lingered in intelligence reports, whispered in criminal circles, and surfaced in financial investigations across the globe. Rumors swirled about his lifestyle. Some claimed he lived like royalty in Moscow, protected, wealthy, and surrounded by bodyguards. Others insisted he had moved abroad, quietly managing his empire from villas in Spain or Switzerland. He was said to own private jets, luxury yachts, and estates worth millions. But unlike flashy gangsters who craved attention, Mikhas preferred mystery. The fewer people who saw him, the harder it was to trace him. He became a ghost, always present, but never visible. His associates ran businesses in Russia, Europe, and the Middle East, but the mastermind himself stayed hidden. For law enforcement, this made him a nightmare. How do you catch a man who leaves no footprints? Every trail led to dead ends, every lead turned into rumors. Some even claimed Mikhas had retired, but the flow of money, drugs, and weapons suggested otherwise. To the public, Mikhas had become a myth. Was he a businessman, a retired mobster, or still the most powerful criminal in Russia? The truth was blurred, and that's exactly how he wanted it. Today, Sergei Mikhailov remains one of the most enigmatic figures in organized crime. Officially, some reports suggest he is still alive, quietly living in Russia, occasionally surfacing in Moscow's elite circles. Others whisper he may have relocated abroad, living under new identities, far from the chaos he once commanded. What's undeniable is his legacy. Mikhas transformed the Russian mafia from street gangs into a global corporation. He professionalized organized crime, turning it into an empire that dealt not only in drugs and weapons, but also in politics, finance, and real estate. His methods became a blueprint for modern criminal syndicates worldwide. For many Russians, Mikhas is a symbol of the wild 1990s, an era of chaos, lawlessness, and fortune-building. To others, he remains the shadow behind Moscow's corruption, a man who proved that power can make anyone untouchable. Dead or alive, his story lives on. Sergei Mikhailov may have disappeared from the headlines, but his empire, his myth, and his fear still echo through the corridors of global organized crime. He is more than a man. He is a legend written in blood, money, and power.
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at join Criminology and step deeper into the dark with us.